1 Corinthians chapter 7, if you have your Bible with you, if you don't, grab one from the chair and follow along. We feel it's important that you do as we turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 as we go through the Bible verse by verse. Years ago, my oldest son, when he was 2 or 3 years old, he looked at me with deep concern and he says, "I don't know who I'm going to marry. I guess I'll just marry Mama." I was like, "Buddy, you can't marry Mama. I'm married to Mama." He's like, "Oh. Well, I guess I'll marry Mary Sue," who was our foster daughter at the time. She was 18. Getting ready to move out. I was like, "Well, she's a little bit older than you." But it's just funny to me. Now he's just like, "I don't ever want to get married." Just, okay, buddy, whatever. I want grandkids. That's what I tell him. But it's funny how early we start to worry about these things. I remember being 16 or 17 years old and just thinking, man, I wonder if I'm ever going to find anybody to marry. And we, just really myopic and really thinking about those things, concerned about those things. There's a lot of things that we worry about relationships or finances or circumstances or what ifs or whens or buts. When are things going to happen in my life? Or what if things don't happen right? And all those things. And yet Jesus tells us very clearly, Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, "Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life." And it's almost as though Jesus wants us to have a life without care in the sense of worldly types of things. And that's really the thrust of what, and kind of the idea behind what Paul is talking to us about today in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, as he's telling us, hey, don't think about the things here because time is short. If you'll stand with me, we'll look at that. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, if you're able to stand with me. Just giving honor to the Word of God. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 25 is where we left off last time. It says, "Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord has in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. Those who weep as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy as though they did not possess. Those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of the world is passing away. But I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, and that she may be holy, both in body and spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, and not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. But if any man thinks he is behaving improperly towards his virgin, if she is past the flower of her youth, and thus it must be, let him do as he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. A wife is bound by the law as long as her husband lives, but if the husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment, and I think I also have the Spirit of God. You may be seated. As we've been going through the book of 1 Corinthians, we have seen kind of an array of things that Paul has dealt with. And of course, the first part of the book, those first several chapters, 6 chapters, he deals with the problems within the church. And everything from sectarianism, people favoring one teacher over another teacher and following one teacher over another teacher. And he says, hey guys, we're all one. All these teachers belong to you for your edification and your growth. You don't need to pick one or the other. And their carnality. In fact, so carnal was the Corinthian church that the sexual behavior and the sexual promiscuity within the church was not even things that were happening amongst the Gentiles, amongst the non-believers. And so he deals with them about those things, about taking each other to court and suing one another in front of the non-believers, and what a bad witness they've been. And so it was pretty interesting going through all those things and all the corrections that he has for them, but also keeping in mind something even more peculiar, and that is in this church that Paul would start out the epistle saying, hey, you guys are accepted by the Lord, that you love the Lord, that you are being sanctified, that you're holy before him, and that he is going to, as you eagerly wait for his return, he's going to present you faultless before his throne in glory. And what that tells me is here is a church who was definitely a Christian church. They were believers. In fact, they had put their trust in Jesus alone for salvation. And that's what a Christian is somebody who doesn't trust in themselves or their good works or how well they're doing for salvation, but they trust in Jesus alone. He alone can save me because he died upon the cross, he was buried, and rose from the grave. And anyone who puts their trust in him would not perish but have everlasting life. They believed that. But that should have an impact on our lives and cause us to desire to live a holy life. And that's where they were not following suit. They kind of had maybe caught some liberal ideas from the community around them and started to think, well, Jesus forgives our sins. And, we pretty much can live however we want outside of that. And yet that just leads to misery within the Christian life. And so Paul is dealing with those things, correcting them, helping them to get through those things. But then in this section, he actually wrote some things, or they wrote some things to him, asked him some questions and said, hey, what about these things? And they talk about marriage and sex and divorce and all those things. And so he deals with all of those issues. And now he's kind of wrapping it up. And yes, he is talking a little bit about marriage still and singleness and those things. But that's not really the main point of this section. The main point of this section is that time is short. Time is short, and you need to pay attention to what's going on around you. Verse 25, he says, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. Now I know you probably all came in here this morning very concerned about virgins. What are we going to do about the virgins? Probably not. Yeah, what is he talking about? What is he talking about, virgins? I mean, all your virgins and all that. No. What Paul is, he uses this term virgin. We have to understand Paul is talking about a young woman who is of marrying age, whether she was a virgin or not. Now, you have to understand this is kind of a synonym. Maybe you could use the word maidens or young women, but this is a woman who's basically grown up. She's no longer a child, and now she's of age to be married. Should she be married? Should she not be married? And those are the questions that people maybe have of their young daughters. And so when he uses this he's talking about a marriable woman. Now, we must understand that in their culture, many of the women in the church who were of this age that were not married yet were probably not virgins. If they grew up in a good, strong Jewish home, they probably had a better chance of being a virgin. Corinth was probably a hard place to raise a good, strong Jewish family, just because it was so rowdy. But if they grew up in the Greek home, where actually the young women at the age of 13 would be encouraged to go become temple prostitutes, probably likely that they weren't virgins. And so Paul, he's just giving instructions for Christians who now have these young daughters, whether virgin or not, young marriable women who, are they going to be married or are they not going to be married? Now, our culture is very much like that, isn't it? Maybe if you grew up in a strong Christian home, the likelihood of you being a virgin is much higher than if you grew up in a worldly home. And yet, in both cases, there can be girls who are virgins, girls who aren't virgins. But let me make an argument for you young women or you young men for keeping your virginity, just for a moment. Why is it important that I keep my virginity until I'm married? Well, if you give yourself, you allow something to be taken from you. Well, what does that mean? Well, not just your virginity, But it's interesting. I've dealt with a lot of young couples, a lot of young people, they've come in, or even older people who've come in and they talk to me about problems that they're having. And it's amazing how often it comes up that I don't want him to touch me that way, or I don't want her to say those words to me. It kills everything when she says that or when he says that. And why? Well, because I gave myself to somebody and they used to say that to me, or they used to touch me like that, or they used to do that. And now, whenever that happens to me, that brings back memories of that other relationship that failed, when I gave myself to that person and they let me down. And so you have this scar on yourself going into a relationship where now your husband, oftentimes that's the case, it's the husband who is not allowed to say certain things to this young woman or to his young wife, or to touch her in certain ways, because if he does, it brings back a flood of memories and kills everything. How sad that is. How sad that is that we bring that baggage into a relationship. It's amazing if you go into a relationship as a virgin and they're the only one you've ever kissed or ever touched or ever been with, how freeing that is. How beautiful that can be. And that's so important. And so it takes something from you, but it also takes something that belongs to your spouse. And that's really heartbreaking. And yet I know, and I'm not somebody who can say, hey, you should never do this because I never did, because I did. And I know firsthand, as a young man, before I was a Christian, I was promiscuous. And so I had to deal with those things within my own marriage and deal with those things. And so I know that the Lord can heal that. But why let those scars be carried over into your next relationship? And I'm sure that anybody like me who has experienced that would say yes. Don't. It's not worth it. It's not worth it to carry those bags into your next relationship. Now, here's another thing this is creepy. And if you have a weak stomach or you can't handle the truth, then you might want to plug your ears right now. But this is something I read the other day, and it kind of blew my mind. And that is that every woman who has been with a man sexually carries his DNA in her brain and her spinal column. Because it gets into your blood and it carries through your blood and it embeds itself into your brain. They were examining these women's brains, and there was up to 50 different men's DNA in their brain. And up to decades old. I think the oldest they found was 50 or 60 years old. Male DNA embedded itself inside the woman's brain because she'd been with a man. And that's kind of creepy. I know. It was just, but the Bible says the two shall become one flesh. And so, that's it's something you don't want to carry around, right? I mean, it's just something you want to avoid at all costs. And so Paul goes on, he says in verse 26, I suppose therefore that it is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. So the first statement concerning young women is, because of this present distress, let's just say, put your plans on hold. That's what Paul is saying. What distress? Well, some have suggested that they were experiencing a famine. I read in a couple places that there was probably a famine. And as I thought about that, I kind of doubt that, because we know that the church in Corinth, as Paul was traveling from Ephesus to Corinth, and he kind of took the long way around and went up to Troas and down. And as he was traveling to Corinth, he was writing epistles. He wrote 1 Corinthians, he wrote 2 Corinthians, and actually there's probably a third epistle somewhere in there that he wrote as well. And so he's writing these epistles to them as he's coming to them. And so months pass, but not years. And then in 2 Corinthians in chapter 7, he tells them, because you are prospering, it's good for you to help those who are not prospering, those who are going through actually persecution and famine in Jerusalem. And so it would seem that they're actually financially prospering. Well, what is this present distress that he's talking about? Most commentators would agree, and we also see evidence for this in the book of Acts, that they were experiencing, especially from the Jewish community, they were experiencing persecution. Pretty severe persecution. When Paul would get to Corinth finally, they would arrest him and take him before Gallio. That's actually a great event in history, because it gives us, Gallio was only in Corinth for 2 years, and it actually helps us to set a timeline for the entire book of Acts. And so Paul finds himself before Gallio. Of course, they're bringing accusations against him. And then, of course, as Paul gets ready to give his defense, Gallio just dismisses the case, and they end up beating the leader of the synagogue instead of Paul. So interesting, they try to persecute him there, and then as Paul gets ready to leave, he wants to leave Corinth with their gift and with the gifts from Macedonia and Achaia and all these other places. He's getting ready to get on the ship to go to Jerusalem by Passover, and he hears of a plot for his life. So basically this whole pilgrimage, this ship full of Jews going to Jerusalem for Passover, he's going to get on the ship, and their plan is somewhere along the way to slit his throat or to throw him overboard or something. And so Paul doesn't get on the ship, doesn't get there by Passover, and then hopes to get there by Pentecost by going the long way around again. This seems to be a pattern for Paul. But that kind of shows us that persecution was happening. So Paul, and in this entire section, we find that Paul is talking about some trouble that they were having specifically. And that's what kind of gives us sets the tone for everything we're reading today, is that there was a present distress that was happening. And so Paul says, put your plans, all those things you're hoping for right now, put them on hold. Verse 27, it says, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. And so again, remembering he's talking about this present distress. Whatever it was that would make more life difficult for them, don't do. If it would be get married, don't get married. Of course, don't be loosed from your wife because of the stress either. But realize we're in this time of trial. Jesus is coming back soon. This was kind of the vibe. I remember this vibe. When I was in Calvary Chapel, Pocatello, I had a pastor. My pastor there was good friends with Chuck Missler. And that time, people were starting to talk about Y2K. People were starting to, there was all these things, all these things happening in the Middle East, and this has to be it, and the European Union and everything. And everybody was talking about, the rapture is going to happen soon. And so there was this overwhelming vibe of any day Jesus is coming back. Any day Jesus is coming back. And I remember one of my friends, Dave, he kind of started to get on that idea of bachelor to the rapture. As if that even rhymed. But that's what, bachelor to the rapture, And I remember a lot of guys were kind of saying that. I did not get on that bandwagon. I think, if Jesus is coming back soon, I want to experience marriage. I want to be married. I didn't have that gift. I didn't pretend to have that gift. Those words would never come out of my mouth. But he was saying that. What's funny is, as time went on, things changed in the Middle East. Different things came up, but different, And I think there's probably always people saying, hey, the rapture is going to happen any second. In fact, I would say that. But you kind of realize, wait a minute, I guess it wasn't going to happen back in 1995. I guess it wasn't going to happen in 1996. I guess, and then Dave ends up finding a woman he likes, and bachelor to the rapture went right out the door. He ended up getting married, having kids, pastoring a church, Calvary Chapel now. And this is the way that things are. Verse 29 says, but I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. Now, time is short. And that was kind of the vibe that we were experiencing back in those days at Calvary Chapel, Pocatello. I think my pastor went through, in 3 years that I was there, he taught the book of Revelation twice, once on Sunday and once on Wednesday. That's, he was like, we're going to go through the book of Revelation again, And it's just that whole vibe was there, that time is short. And yet, was time short? I really do believe that Jesus could come back at any minute. For those who don't know what I'm talking about when I say the rapture, we'll cover this extensively in chapter 15, but just to give you a brief description, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17 says that we who are alive and remain at the coming of the Lord will be caught up in the air to meet the Lord. And thus we will always be with the Lord. And so basically what that word there in the Greek is, that word caught up is harpazo in the Greek, raptus in the Latin. And so that's where we get our word rapture. Now, why don't we just say caught up? Or I think probably the great catch up or the great harpazo didn't sound quite as cool as the great rapture, right? So rapture won. And so that's what we call it the rapture. But the word rapture actually does appear in the Bible, 1 Thessalonians 4:17, when Paul says we will be caught up to be with the Lord. And the idea is that Jesus is going to come back to the earth, not coming down to the earth, but coming across the sky as lightning flashes from the east to the west. And those who are believers will be taken off the earth in the moment, in the twinkling of an eye. We will be caught up into the air, and we will be with the Lord. And at that time, if my rendering is correct, and a lot of people have different views on this, this isn't an essential doctrine, you don't have to believe this to be saved. But in my rendering of it, as I study the Scripture, I see that that is going to happen before a 7-year period of time that God specifically set aside for the Jewish nation. And that last 7 years is going to be when the Antichrist is revealed, and basically the world will change very radically during that time. If you're interested in this, I did a series called The End, which you can get on our website. So you can study more about that. But Paul had his own reasons for believing that time is short. You know, if you ask Paul, why do you think time is short? He probably would have given you 10 good reasons why I think Jesus is going to come back within the next few months or the next few years. He probably would have said, well, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. Nero is, he's starting to persecute people. I mean, it would make sense. And people would be like, oh yeah, it's got to happen. If you would go back to 10:17 and read the commentators who were studying Bible prophecy at that time, I bet you they could have given you 10 good reasons why Jesus is going to come back any day now, because of the present things that were happening in their day. And you fast forward to 2017, and I could give you 10 good reasons why Jesus is going to come back in our time. And it would seem that Jesus has actually pre-programmed that for the last 2,000 years to be in our DNA as believers, that Jesus could come back at any moment. Paul believed Jesus was coming back in his day. Don't make any long-term plans. Was Paul wrong? Well, thankfully, Paul didn't set a date. You see, that's where we go wrong, isn't it? So when we say Jesus is coming back at this date, and we've seen that happen, over the years, 1800s, the 1900s, even just a few years, 2012. Remember, they had the big thing with Harold camping, and the Mayan calendar was happening the same time, and everybody was like, "Oh my goodness, the Mayans had it right, and Harold camping, I wonder if he's right." And then that day came, and that day went, and here we still are. And I heard somebody say something really thoughtful. They said, I don't think that we should judge Harold Camping. I don't think that we should blame him, because after all, it wasn't the end of the world. Right? Those who laugh last think the slowest. Okay. Some of you just got it. Okay. But this is the way that Jesus designed it to be. In fact, Jesus said this. He said in Acts chapter 1, verse 7, he said, "It's not for you to know the times or the seasons." I love that he said that. You're not even going to know the times of the seasons, the years of the months. You're not even going to have that down. You're not going to know the times of the seasons which the Father has put in his own authority. He also said 7 times, actually, within the Gospels, he said something along this line. He says, "Watch therefore, for you do not know the hour your Lord is coming." He said in another place, you do not know the day or the hour. He says in another place, he will come as a thief. And in fact, that was the theme that would be carried out through the New Testament, that the Lord comes as a thief in the night. He comes unexpectedly. When they say peace and safety, it's going to be like nothing's wrong. It's not like, oh, look at what's happened over there, and look what's happened over there. It's like, oh, finally everything's wonderful. When they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction will come upon them. It's not going to be something that people are expecting. It's going to happen in an hour at a time when it's unexpected. It seems, as we go through the Bible, it's constantly telling us that Jesus is going to come back when nobody's expecting it, like Noah when he got into the ark and then suddenly the flood came upon them, like Lot, when everyone was in the city, and the day that he was taken out of the city, fire and brimstone rained upon the city. There was no warning. And so too will the coming of the Son of Man be at a time when there is no warning. Now, how do we know that it's going to happen in our day? Well, it's interesting. One of the biggest reasons why we think that we are in the end times and that it is probably going to happen in our day, and I think probably spectacularly more than anything that's ever happened in history, is that the nation of Israel is back in the land. Now, John Walvoord, who wrote the book on the rapture question, great book, great evidences for a pre-trib rapture. Mysteriously, he was one of the guys who said, I don't think that the Lord could come back quite yet. Back in 1930, he wrote a paper that said, I don't think that the Lord could come back yet because Israel has not become a nation again. Now, at that time, other commentators said, that's ridiculous. Why do you think Israel has to become a nation again? It's not going to ever happen. It's impossible. And yet Walvoord was a student of the Scriptures, and he said, no, he said the rapture could happen, and Israel could become a nation right after that, but I think that Israel will become a nation before the rapture happens. And then guess what happened? May 14th, 1948. In one day, just like Jeremiah prophesied, as it says in Ezekiel chapter 36 through 39, that in the last days Israel will be in the land, Israel became a nation again. In 1967, they captured Jerusalem. They gave half of it back, but now they have Jerusalem, they have the land of Israel, and God has put them in our day, not too long ago, 1948, has put Israel back in the land of Israel. And so that's significant because all the things that happen in the last days deal with the nation of Israel. Of course, that last 7 years is specifically for Israel and for the Jewish people. And there has to be a Holy of Holies in the temple at that time. And so we see these things happening around us. And it was 1948. That was a while ago, right? And so we could kind of get used to the idea that Israel's been there. And maybe even people my age, I'm only 43, getting old, would look at that and say, well, Israel's been there all my life. It just doesn't seem like it could ever be any different. But it is a very significant thing to think that they're there. And there are people who are alive today who were young when that happened. And so that's significant. The other thing that's significant, and this is a few things, I'm not going to give you 10, I'm just going to give you a couple. But another thing that's significant is that Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 24 that somebody is going to be out in their field and they're going to see something that happens in the Holy of Holies of the Jewish temple. Now, if you know anything about the Holy of Holies of the Jewish temple, only one person ever gets to go in there. That's the high priest on the day of Yom Kippur. No person gets to see what's in the Holy of Holies. But way far away in Judea, somebody will be out in their field, and they're going to see, Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the Holy of Holies, if you're out in your field, if you're on your rooftop. Now, you have to think about this. It's only been probably the last, 8 years, 7 years, that we've had 4G technology. I remember the first pastor's conference I went to, and I got to talk to Shannon on Skype without Wi-Fi. Because before that, when it was just 3G, you couldn't talk on Wi-Fi because it didn't stream video. But 4G came out, and we could talk. And I could be out in my field, and I could watch a YouTube video. Or I could be up on my rooftop and watch a YouTube video without Wi-Fi. Only in the last few years has this been possible that people will be able to see what's happening inside the Holy of Holies. And at the Temple Institute, they have the blueprints. You can actually get a copy of the blueprints of the temple, the third temple that they're going to build. They have everything they need to build it. They just need to let the Palestinians let us have the room on top of the Temple Mount. Good luck. But they have everything they need to put it together, and it's all set to go. The blueprints show cable access into the Holy of Holies so that they can have video. Every eye shall see it. The other thing that's interesting is now we have the technology for Revelation chapter 13. That he will cause great and small, every man to receive a mark on his right hand or his forehead, and he will not be able to buy or sell without the mark of the beast. Now, we live in a day and age when we have implantable technology, microchips, but now they've just come out with something new. Ink tattoos that are metallic ink, they can print microchips right on your skin. That's not creepy. And so we live in a day and age where actually because of Google and the World Wide Web super information highway thingy, all the technology, all the servers, Google watches everything. They're even looking at your house. You know, isn't that creepy that you can like zoom in on your house, look in your front yard from space? It's crazy, the world we live in. But they can monitor everything now. And they can watch people, and they can, you know, if somebody had the chip, they wouldn't be able to commit a crime, they wouldn't be able to go anywhere, they wouldn't be able to pass checkpoints, they wouldn't be able to buy or sell. And so we live in a day where that technology is possible. I believe that we're in the last of the last days, and I believe that Jesus could come back any day. In fact, he could come back tomorrow. But he might not come back for 100 years. What will technology be like then? How many more things will there be in 100 years if the Lord tarries? And so it's kind of been programmed into the church from the very beginning. There's always been good reasons Jesus could come back at any minute. And he does tell us, watch and be ready. Not watch for the Antichrist, not watch for the abomination of desolation. He says, watch and be ready for your Lord's return. He's telling us to watch for him. So he could come at any moment. He will always come unexpectedly. But Paul has his own reasons for believing that time is short, and yet, isn't it? I mean, in reality, isn't life just a vapor? And the Lord may not come back by rapture in the next 2 days or the next 3 years or the next decade. But you might walk out of this building and go to get in your car and a semi-truck comes and just plows you out and you're history. That's morbid, right? But it's a reality. I don't know how many times, I mean, just even looking at our prayer requests, how many times people send out prayer requests saying, my uncle just got cancer, I just got cancer, 3 months to live. I was blown away. One of our good friends, a lady who attended this church, she went to the hospital, the doctor said, call your family. She died in 3 days. Gone, unexpectedly. Time is short. You're not promised tomorrow. And so when we think about our life and what our life means, we have to realize time is short. And how am I spending my days? Oh, that God would put eternity in our hearts and not let us get bogged down by the day-to-day things of this life, of this world. And that's what Paul is encouraging. Again, verse 29, the second part of it, he went on to say, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as they had none. In other words, you know, if things are going crazy around you, things are difficult around you, it's probably not a time to really focus on your marriage. When you're just trying to stay alive, or you're thinking, you know, the person who lives next door to me doesn't even know Jesus, and I could be killed for my faith any day. What's important? Those who weep as though they did not weep. In other words, you go to a funeral to bury your husband or your wife or your child. He's saying, don't take the time that most people would take in normal circumstances to mourn over that. You can't take that time during this present distress. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. You just won the lottery. Something good just happened to you. You can't throw a party. There's no time for parties right now. Those who buy as though they did not possess. You just bought a piece of land. You don't go and say, okay, this is where we're going to build our house. You kind of forget about it for a while. And those who use this world is not misusing it, for the form of this world is passing away. So Paul is talking about that end times timeline. It's going to go from the present era to the tribulation period, and then the Antichrist will be in charge, and then after the tribulation, Jesus will come back and he will establish his throne, and the entire world is going to change. And so Paul is trying to get them away from their myopic view of what's on this earth and say, hey, look to eternity. Look to what's coming. Don't focus on the things that are in front of you because things are too stressful right now for that. We have to remember that this is, for sure, a time of trouble that they're going through. And so this isn't the normal thing that Paul would write to a church. Now, we might remember earlier in this same exact chapter, Paul gave instructions about married people and why they should abstain from intimacy. Remember that? He said, don't abstain except for a time that you might give yourself to prayer and fasting. So it kind of puts perspective on what he's saying here. Basically, he's saying instead of enjoying marital intimacy all the time, he says you might, because of the present distress, you might want to spend some time in prayer and fasting. Gives them kind of a clue as to what he means when he says these things. And I think that this is how Christians should live. We should be watching as though Jesus could come back any minute. And every plan that we make in life, as Jesus instructs us and as James instructs us, we should say, if the Lord wills, I'm going to do this or that or the other thing. And so all of our plans should be, I'm looking long term, I'm assuming that I'm going to live to be old, and I'm looking long term, and so I'm saying, okay, Lord, if you will, this is what I want to do next. Because anything else is evil. That's what the Bible tells us. Anything outside of if the Lord wills is evil. It's making plans for yourself. Jesus says, expect me to come at any time, but plan by saying if the Lord wills. And we should go about our day, but always adorned as a bride who could be called to the wedding at any moment. And that was the Jewish wedding ceremony, right? The bridegroom could come at any moment and call his bride, and she had to be ready. She had to have oil in her lamp and ready to go. And Jesus would instruct us the same way. And this mindset that Jesus could come back should and does have a purifying effect upon the church. If I really believe that Jesus could come back at any moment, I am going to be living like Jesus could come back at any moment. If I think that the Lord tarries, Jesus warned us about that, didn't he? He says, be weary of the person who says that the Lord tarries. The Lord can't come back right now, lest you eat and drink with the drunkards and beat your fellow servant. That's the temptation of our hearts, isn't it? To live lewdly. If I don't think Jesus could come back tomorrow or today or in 10 seconds, then I might let my guard down. Well, I know the Antichrist is going to come first, so I'll just wait for that and then I'll get serious. No. Jesus could come back at any minute. And so let it have a purifying effect upon your life. And in times of distress, even more so. Verse 32, it says, but I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. Ain't that the truth? Marriage is work. It's good, rewarding work, but it's work. And it does take time. I always tell young couples, I get these young couples, they're super on fire for the Lord, serving the Lord. They're going on mission trips. They're doing great things for Jesus. And then they say, we're in love with each other. We want to get married. And I think, what a great couple to get married. But then I warn them. I say, when you get married, I just wanted to warn you, it's going to take its toll on your relationship with the Lord. It just is. You're not going to be able to go to that 3 a.m. Bible study that you used to go, or stay up and pray with everybody, like you used to, every night of the week. Before I was a Christian, before I was married, I used to spend late hours, very late hours at Denny's, and we'd be there till 3 in the morning, witnessing to people, doing Bible study. I would go to a Bible study every single night of the week. Once I got married, I tried to drag Shannon along to all that, but it just wasn't really feasible all the time, right? And it became less and less feasible. She has epilepsy. She can't stay up late. And that just kind of changed everything. I had to readjust my life. Not that I regret that. But that's just the reality. You have other people to worry about other than yourself. And you have to take concern with that. Now, the beautiful thing is that if you both seek the Lord and you grow in relationship to each other and get over your selfishness, because you're a very selfish person, more so than you know until you get married, and then you realize. And then you have kids, and you realize you're more so. You realize as a couple you're selfish. Then you have a child, and you're like, oh, man, I loved my sleep. But we get over those things, and as we grow together, I believe that you can be even more effective for the Lord as a Christian couple. And I think that's some encouragement. But at the beginning, it definitely takes some time takes some effect on your relationship with the Lord. Your marriage does. Now, I was thinking about Carly up here last week, sharing with us that she's going. I'm going to go. So I'm going to go for a month and in this dangerous place and help children. And you think about that. How would it go over if I went to Shannon and said, "Hey, Shannon, I got this awesome opportunity to go to a really dangerous place and serve children and share the gospel, which is illegal, for a month." Yeah, that's going to go over like a lead balloon, Are you kidding? You have a family you have to provide for and take care of, right? And I mean, it would just be foolish for me to do that. It was difficult enough when we had one child and I went to India for 2 weeks. That was hard enough. When we went to Rome, I took her with me because that's way easier, right? It was a burden, but we had to do it together. But I think of that. Guys like Bruce Olson, 19-year-old kid can go down to Argentina, wander into the jungle, get shot by arrows, and lead an entire tribe of Modelones to Christ. Who can do that? A single guy. A young single man with no attachments. He says, verse 34, "There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of this world, that she may be holy, both in body and spirit." I pray that's the truth. "But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, that not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction." Again, there's great benefit to that. I don't have this gift, and I don't really care for that gift, to be celibate, to be single. Maybe some of you have that gift. Use it for the Lord is what he's saying. I think of people in history, ladies like Amy Carmichael in India. Was there for years, grew old and died there. She was single her entire life. I think of that Katie Davis who left America and her popular teeny boppy thing and went on a mission trip to Uganda for a couple weeks and decided, I'm going to stay there forever. And she adopted like 25 kids. Single woman, living with 25 orphans. And that's what she's given her life to. Or Corrie ten Boom, who never married and then, of course, was taken to Ravenbrook. And then after she got out of Ravenbrook, just spent her time traveling from place to place as the Lord would lead her, and just sharing the good news of Jesus Christ, but also the good news of forgiveness and the good news of grace and the miracles that God did there through her and her sister Betsy. And the Lord would call them and they could go wherever they wanted to go. And they had a gift of celibacy that could be used by the Lord. But Paul says, I just want to say this. I think it would be beneficial during this present distress for you to stay as you are, but I don't want to put a leash on you. I don't want you to think you have to be bachelor to the rapture. I don't want you to think that you have to be single and alone, a spinster your entire life. If that's not your gift, realize I'm not commanding this. This is just Paul's opinion, who's been found faithful in this specific circumstance. He says, if you have that gift, use it. Verse 36, "But if any man thinks he is behaving improperly towards his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well." Now, there's some debate amongst the translation as to what this is talking about. The King James, the New King James, place this as the father of a young woman who's now grown to marriageable age, and whether he should give her in marriage. That's how they spin this. But if you look at the other translations, and if you have any other translation, NIV, ESV, Holman, New Living Translation, they translate this from the side of the groom. It's actually difficult to decipher in the Greek. It could be either way. And so both have their merits, both have their ideas, and either is applicable. So he has planned to marry her, but because of the present distress, can wait to marry until the trouble passes. That's the idea. And I kind of lean towards that it's the young man who's been betrothed to a woman. In other words, he came to her father. He offered the bride price. Let's just say it was 10 oxen. Here's, I'm going to give this as a gift or as a payment for raising my wife for me. That was the idea behind it. Not I'm purchasing a slave, but you raised my wife for me. I want to pay you back for that. And as the woman came, she would, the father of the bride would first accept the bride price. If he accepted it, then the groom would pour a glass of wine, he'd take a drink, and he'd hand it to the bride, and she would take it, and she'd dump it out and say, "You scum, I don't want to marry you." Or she would drink it. If she drank it, then they were legally connected. They were engaged, but it was stronger than engagement. She couldn't take her ring off and say, "Forget about it." It was a contract. They'd have to get divorced at that point. He'd have to divorce her if he wanted out of that contract. So there was a legal contract. And so there's present distress. And he could go and take her and she could become his wife. But things are pretty stressful right now. Things are pretty intense right now. Probably better if we wait. And so it says in verse 38, "So then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better." The New Living Translation reads it this way: "So the person who marries his fiancée does well, and the person who doesn't marry does even better." Now, again, remember, he's talking about distress that they're going through. On a personal note, as one who's been found faithful, I say, if you can't afford to be married and get married and live on your own, and you have to live off the goodwill of your parents or somebody else, it's better to keep your virgin. Right? Capiche? If you can't afford to provide for your wife, put it off. Now, my wife and I dated for 2.5 years, I think, before we got married. We were engaged for over a year. Why were we engaged for over a year? We actually set our date and moved it back. Why? Because I couldn't afford to rent a house, pay the bills, and we kind of looked at that. And so when we could afford our own wedding, because we didn't have any parents to pay for it for us, when we could afford our own wedding, we paid for that. We paid for first and last month's rent. We could pay we look at our budget. We did a budget. We could pay our utilities. We could buy whatever we needed. That's when we got married. Do not get married planning on moving in with your mom and dad. That's not marriage. Okay? Just saying. I just want to keep you from trouble because I have seen so many couples over the years foolishly do this and how much drama and problems it caused them. Don't plan that way. Provide for your spouse. And ladies, don't give yourself to this man until he has paid a lot of money for an expensive ring, and he puts both of those pieces of that ring on your ring finger, and then in front of everyone he knows, he makes promises before God to you. Do not give yourself to him sexually. Remember what the Bible says in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, "Marriage is honorable among all, and a bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge." And that's an important and a scary thing to realize. We need to make sure that we go into marriage, we stay celibate, and this is why. I don't know why, but when you sleep with each other before marriage, you always will have problems in the marriage bed. It's like a curse that happens to you. And I've dealt with many couples who have gone through that. Just the struggles that they go through, because what they did when they first got together, it was wrong, and they knew it was wrong, and they felt bad about it, and now all of a sudden they feel bad about doing it when they're married. Why? Because it wasn't the way that it was supposed to be. Let things happen the way that they're supposed to be. Paul moves on to widows now. Verse 39. "A wife is bound by the law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to marry whom she wishes, only in the Lord." Now, we might read that and say, duh, of course, if her husband's dead, she can marry whoever she wants, right? No, not necessarily. Well, what do you mean? Well, back in the day, in Jewish law, if you were married to a man and he died, and you gave him no male child, then you were obligated to marry his brother. Even if he had another wife, you had to become his second wife and marry his brother for the express purpose that you would have a male child through that brother and produce an offspring for your dead husband to be his heir to carry on the family name. I know, it sounds crazy. But that's the way that it was. And if he didn't have a brother, then you married his closest male relative. And that's just the way that it worked. And that was Jewish law back in those days because of the land and the, keeping the possessions of the land. There was all these rules and laws. But in the New Covenant, Paul says no. She's no longer under the law of marriage, but can marry whoever she wants. That is in the Lord. Let me just say that again. Marry whoever you want. That is in the Lord. And I think that Paul would say the same thing to a virgin. You can marry whoever you want. That is in the Lord. Maybe that's a word for you here this morning. Because you're not free to marry anybody, just anybody you want to. Oh, he has breath, he's breathing and he stands upright. No, in the Lord. And it's so important. The idea of marriage for a Christian is that they marry somebody who is a Christian. Do not be unequally yoked with a non-believer. It just causes way more problems. That will really affect your relationship with the Lord. And you can probably find many people who will tell you that. So, verse 40 again, but she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment, and I think I also have the Spirit of God. Now, I think about this, and Shannon and I, every once in a while, we'll talk about that, I tell her, if I die, I hope you find a guy, who loves the Lord, maybe a pastor or somebody who you can marry, and, whatever. And then she tells me, if I die, don't you dare get remarried. No, I'm just kidding. She used to say that. Now she's like, no, you'll probably find a... No, but, I honestly think about this. If anything ever happened to my wife, I don't know that I'd want to date again. Doesn't that sound horrible? I mean, just the thought of having to go through the drama and the games of that and just having to train another woman? I mean, no way. Okay, no, she probably trained me. But, we have 21 years of getting used to each other, and we're barely there, and it's like, could you imagine having to get used to somebody else's bad habits, and I'm too old for that, And so I don't know, this sounds really appealing to me. You're doing a lot better if you just stay single. Like, yeah, I think so. But what it comes down to is not that this is the standard thing that Paul would tell people. Actually, this is what he's saying because of the present distress. I think you'll be happier if you're not seeking another man. You're not, courting or dating or whatever because things are traumatic right now. And there's times when things get more traumatic, in our country. I think this last presidential election, we were kind of watching things, it's like, okay, he's a good candidate. Oh, wait, he's gone. Oh, he's a good candidate. No, he's gone. Oh, he's a good... Wait, they're all gone. What's going on? You have bad and worse, and everybody's freaking out. And then, it went probably better for, I think most people in Idaho think, okay, I think I like that choice better. And so we were pretty happy about it, and so far things are good. But I think a lot of people were thinking, I'm going to need to move to Canada or something. Or I'm going to, need to get out, and yet, things are okay. But there'll be times when there's stress and there's difficulty, and there's times when things are going great. And yet you kind of have to make your decisions based on those things. Paul is saying because of this distress, I think you're probably better off if you don't get married. And yet what would he tell Timothy? Timothy, who was going to Ephesus where there wasn't that type of thing happening. He says, if a widow is under 60, let her remarry and not become a burden on the church. Don't let her be taken into the number. And there was widows who were, basically were paid, the church paid for them to live. He says, if they're over 60, take them into the number, but if they're under 60, don't. Let them remarry. Encourage them to remarry. So it's a very different set of rules based on the circumstances. And so Paul is dealing with that specifically. What does this all mean? It all simply comes down to this. What does the Lord want you to do in your circumstances? And as we get into God's Word and we read this, I know that this chapter has a lot in it. And you are listening to these things and you're making life decisions based on that. You're like, oh, I never thought of that before. And I have people tell me that all the time. Man, that thing we looked at in 1 Corinthians, that really spoke to me. Oh, that really changed my mind about something. That really impacted me. And I know that this is impacting you in some way or another. And so what do I do with that? What I do with that is I say, okay, Lord, this is what I felt your Spirit speak to me during that message. And so this is what I want to do. What do you think I should do? And allow the Lord to direct us and guide us in the direction that He wants to direct us and guide us. And that's what the Christian life is about. Paul gives these instructions not to put a leash, not to say this is the way it has to be, but rather to awaken you to the idea that there's more to this than just what my heart desires. And our world is telling us, follow your heart, but Paul is saying, no, follow the Lord. Follow the Lord, and sometimes the Lord's going to lead you in a different direction than your heart. The heart is deceitfully wicked above all things. Who can know it? But the Lord, He leads us into paths of righteousness for His name's sake. So, follow the Lord. Run these things by the Lord. Say, Lord, what do you want me to do in this situation? And He will direct your paths. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word. We're grateful that you are in control. We're grateful we don't have to figure all this stuff out by ourselves, but that you truly do have answers for us. You truly can give us a peace about the direction that we should go, Lord. And I pray that that would be our reality this morning, Lord, as we consider the things of your word and these instructions, the idea that time could be short. Lord, how are we to live, Lord, during these last days? Could it be that you're coming back in a few days or a few years? And how do you want me to live in light of that? Lord, help us to be serious about our walk with you, that you might be glorified in our lives, that we might trust you and follow you with our whole heart. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.